So the first thing that I want to say is that my dog Maisie might start barking. I have no control over that whatsoever. So apologies in advance if you hear that over me. It depends on whether or not somebody has the nerve to walk past the window. So I wanted to show you a photograph of her because I did actually manage to get her in The Guardian. And it just goes to show that I don't only write about male violence towards women and girls, but I occasionally have the odd foray into something else. So Cherry, if you could put that first handout up, that would be great. And can somebody just give me an indication that my voice is coming through? Yeah, okay, great. So what I really want to do is, so you see there's Maisie. So can you see the resemblance between her and Princess Diana? I mean, you could not tell them apart, right? Okay, brilliant. So now that we've got that over with, I want to just pay tribute to our wonderful host, Cherry Smiley, who I first met in Vancouver some years ago when I was researching my book on prostitution, The Pimping of Prostitution. And I interviewed Cherry and met some of her colleagues and friends, and we've been in contact and comrades ever since. And so I'd just like to alert you to an interview that I did with Cherry when we met a couple of years ago. And it was in Truth Dig magazine, a US-based leftist publication. And I think that despite the fact that we all know how wonderful Cherry is, you probably don't know the quarter of what she's done, and neither do I. But please do read this after our session today, if you can. So I just want to give you a little bit of background about my work and about how I got to doing the kind of feminist activism and writing that I do. So I was born in the northeast of England into a working class community in 1962, and there wasn't much opportunity then to be feminist. I grew up in a social housing estate, and women were expected to, of course, marry the local boy and have children and work in a factory. And so I moved away from home when I was 16 to meet other lesbians. And I ended up in a city called Leeds, which is in Yorkshire in England. And it was 1979, just at the very end. I was 17. And it was a perfect moment for me to arrive because the anti-male violence against women movement was really vibrant. And so I met a number of women who were about 15 years older than me. They'd all been through the left. They'd pretty much all been to university, but they weren't all middle class and privileged. And they took me under their wing. They mentored me. And through doing the kind of feminism that relied on very visible direct action and physical protest, I learned about theory rather than reading the books that at that time I couldn't possibly have deciphered. And one thing about that time was that a man was killing women in the north of England. He'd been killing women that he found on the streets, that he followed home late at night, that he followed in the daytime to their university lodgings. Even in one instance, a 16-year-old coming from school. And his name, we were later to find, was Peter Sutcliffe. And he'd killed at least 13 women and left 7 for dead by the time he was arrested at the very beginning of 1980. And the feminists that I met at that time were very, very angry with the police response to this and also the media response, because a stone had been lifted up and what we saw was pure misogyny, pure unbridled misogyny. The police spoke about this spate of killings as though the women in prostitution that were the victims had it coming to them, that somehow this was an occupational hazard. And Of course, the women who weren't in prostitution were also seen as deserving of being raped and murdered because they had the nerve to be out in bars without a male chaperone. And then, of course, when he killed a 16-year-old schoolgirl and the press and police couldn't ascribe any blame to her, although I'm sure they could have tried and succeeded, she was, after all, out without a man. The local newspaper ran a headline, something like, they called him, of course, the Ripper, because, of course, many journalists have great imaginations, don't they? And they decided that she was his first mistake, that an innocent victim had been killed, that the Ripper had gone too far, that it was serious now. So we got from that the very clear message that prostituted women and women who were in the main working class, who liked to drink alcohol, who didn't go out only with their husbands, were deserving of anything. So that really catapulted me into direct action and public protest. And the very first thing that I did that was kind of semi-illegal, I suppose, and it wouldn't be possible today because of CCTV, was we put posters up across Leeds, which we had mocked up using the logo of the police area. And we told men that there was a curfew on them and that they had to be at home in the house by 8 o'clock at night, because we were so angry that there was a curfew on women, with police telling us that we had to keep ourselves safe by being at home, when we knew that the site of the most grave danger for women and girls was in fact the home, because of sexual abuse, because of domestic violence, because of rape, perpetrated by men that we know, our family members, whoever. And so that was the way that I became involved in feminism. And from then, later, I started to focus with women that led the way, looking at the way the criminal justice system failed women as both victims of men's violence and also when they themselves committed criminal acts as a response to male violence. So the first thing that we looked at was the way that men get away with killing women known to them by saying, she was nagging me, she was unfaithful to me, I came home and found her in bed with my best friend. And interestingly, the law that they used, the partial defence to murder, which is called provocation, was first developed during the Second World War, when men came home from the war and claimed that they found their wives shacked up with another man. And we saw this happen over and over again, that men would say, I killed her, I just saw red, I can't tell you what happened, but she pushed me too far. And we called it the nagging and shagging defence, because it was always about those two things. And at the same time, there were women who were killing out of desperation and self-defense. They were killing men who were about to kill them, who threatened the lives and the safety of their families. So from that, I founded with two other feminist activists, a group called Justice for Women. By then I'd moved to London. And there were a number of cases of women that got very little press coverage, who had killed men and been convicted of murder, despite years of violence, years of threats, desperately trying to get away. And then, of course, judges would not be sympathetic. They'd be sympathetic to men such as one called Joseph McGrail, who killed his nagging wife. And when the judge was telling him that he was given a non-custodial sentence for the lesser offence of manslaughter rather than murder, the judge commented to Joseph McGrail that his wife, who he kicked to death, would have tried the patience of a saint. So throughout that time, we were doing this, as we do now, with no funding. We wouldn't take state funding because we wanted to campaign and not be a charity. We then were made aware of a case of a woman called Emma Humphreys, who had killed her pimp boyfriend in 1985. And by the time she wrote to Justice for Women in 1992, she'd served 7 years in prison. Emma was 16 years old when she killed her pimp after he threatened to gang rape her, and after enduring months of hell. And she was given an all-male legal team. She was too traumatized when she was in court, as barely 17 years old, to give evidence about the abuse. She couldn't articulate it. And so she was sent to prison for life. And when Emma wrote to us, she said, I've just been looking in the media just been reading about other cases of women who've killed violent men. And I've heard your campaigns on the radio, seen it on the TV, and I'm not a murderer. Can you help me? And then we started a 3-year campaign to free Emma from prison. But there was always a wider aim. There was always a wider picture, bigger picture for us, which was to change the law and to change attitudes so that women like Emma do not come before the courts again in this way. That when women have been through what Emma had been through, that they are supported and they're not classed as murderers. That somebody steps in before that final fatal act. And usually, of course, as we know, it's way more common for women to die at the hands of violent men than it is for women to defend themselves and to kill. So we wanted state intervention to support women like Emma. But we set about a 3-year campaign, which was a big public campaign. And remember, this was before social media. It was pretty much almost before mobile phones. It was just about, we were getting emails, but we didn't use it. We put physical posters up all around London, all around other cities, all around the UK, free Emma Humphreys, and some text as to why they should support the campaign. We were in and out of the Houses of Parliament, speaking with MPs, speaking with policymakers, speaking to journalists. And one thing that was very important about Emma's case was that she had a background of male violence, which had accumulated. And at the point that she killed Trevor Armitage, the pimp, she couldn't take any more. She had literally been saturated in torture, in sexual exploitation and violence in all of her short life, from her father to John's punters on the streets, to her stepfather who battered her mother, and then the children, killed the pets, locked her in her room. And nobody stepped in, nobody intervened. So what we did in gathering testimony from Emma, in gathering her story over that 3-year period on behalf of the lawyers that were handling her case that we'd engaged, was that we painted a picture of her whole life. And when Emma was released from prison in 1995, the law effectively changed because she won her appeal based on that cumulative provocation. And hearts and minds have been changed alongside the law. Because there's no aftercare for prisoners, and in particular women and those that have been through sexual trauma, Emma died 3 years later through an accidental overdose of the chemical kosh, as we call it, the drug that she had been put on to keep her quiet in prison. And alongside campaigning on behalf of women like Emma Humphreys, we also sought to make it very clear about the unsuitability of prison for anyone who is not a danger to the public. And when sexist men in the law would argue with us when we tried to campaign for all of our women. And they would say, but you can't just let these women out of prison who've killed these men. There could be a danger. And we would say, there'd only be a danger to other violent men. So that was Emma, and that led to more work with abused women who'd killed. But what Emma taught me very clearly was how prostitution is the worst thing that can happen to women and girls, and of course some men and boys, but in far smaller numbers. And I learned through the 3 years that we had with Emma on the outside, as well as the time we were campaigning when she was in prison, about the dynamics of prostitution. And I got to understand why it was so difficult to talk about prostitution as violence against women. When we would do this, and this was even back in the 1980s, the pro-sex work lobby would pop up and start defending it, and they would wheel a woman out who was the happy hooker. And we'd be told, because this was the era of the first tranche of identity politics in the women's movement. We're now, of course, in an era of identity politics where there is no politics and no identity to rely on. But anyway, back then, we were told, you can't speak for this prostituted woman, or sex worker rather, because you haven't experienced it, we have. And we would argue, well, we also haven't been battered by our husbands, and not all of us have been raped. So why is it okay that we speak on behalf of those women? But they could never give us a proper answer. So the following year, the year after Emma was released from prison, there was a big conference in Brighton in England. And it was the very first ever international conference on violence against women and girls. And it was a week-long conference. And at that conference, I met women that would become my friends. Andrea Dworkin, Ruchira Gupta, Janice Raymond, a number of other women who presented at that event. And one woman who presented, Norma Hoteling, was a sex trade survivor. And she had been in prison for prostitution offences. She'd also been misusing substances. She was a heroin addict for decades. And when she got clean and came out of prison, she decided that she wanted to do something to help the women get out of the sex trade. This was back in the 80s. And she set up an exiting service for women. And she worked alongside some of the good police officers, the officers that agreed not to arrest the women. And then they would go on a support program, build up their lives, build up their confidence, and to get help in unpicking the trauma. And she worked out that she needed quite a bit of money to sustain this project full-time and long-term. So she came up with an idea of a John school, which would be, because the police, of course, didn't arrest the Johns, didn't arrest the men who buy women, that she would charge these men who were arrested by police, because she got the police agreement that they should do that, just for a period of time. And she would charge them $500 to go on a 12-week re-education course, not thinking for 1 minute that many of the men would dig deep into their good side and decide not to abuse women in prostitution anymore, but so that they'd be scared to do so again, because the police would have their DNA, they'd have their names and addresses. And so their money funded the exiting programs. And we decided after that conference that we would do something similar ourselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. So that basically is a potted history of how I came to focus most of the time on the global sex trade as violence against women and girls. And the book that I'm writing at the moment, that I'm going to focus on during the rest of this talk, is looking at the way feminism's been co-opted, as Cherry mentioned earlier, for the benefit of men, and popular feminism in universities now is in fact feminism for men, personified. So my book is called Feminism for Women, The Real Route to Liberation. And I look at some key myths that I'm trying to debunk within that. And one, of course, is that we're not allowed to have a definition of feminism. So we've all heard, haven't we? Beyonce's a feminist. Sarah Palin's a feminist. Margaret Thatcher's a feminist. Anyone's a feminist who's a woman with a loud voice. And this, of course, is nonsense. Nobody's suggesting for a minute that we would tell women they're not allowed to use the word. They can define themselves how they like. But what is feminism? And this is what really interests me. We don't just have the right, those of us that are active in the women's liberation movement, to define feminism. We have a duty, we have a moral imperative. Every single social justice movement on the planet is allowed a set of aims and objectives. But feminism seems to be just whatever anyone thinks it might be. So to me, feminism is based on one key perspective and understanding, that women are oppressed and that we have a commitment to end women's oppression, and that women are a sex class and that men are a sex class. In other words, boys aren't born bad and girls aren't born angels. This is about power. And it's about one group having power, structural power, social power, legal power over the other. And importantly, it's a collective movement, not an individual issue. And male violence and superiority and women's subordination are neither innate nor inevitable. And that, I think, is a really important point. Because, of course, feminism gets rewritten, always. And I would argue that the one and only thing that unites women everywhere, women and girls, whatever our class, ethnicity, race, or geographical placement, is the threat and reality of male violence. And that is the key to women's liberation. That we end male violence, but more than that we begin to imagine a world without it. Because unless we can actually imagine this world, we can't fight for it. We can't effectively strive towards it. Now, take the issue of prostitution. Every single time I would go to conferences, events, speak with friends, family, wherever, good people, leftist people, conservative people, people in general, even women within our movement. And you would say to them, what shall we do to solve the harms of prostitution? What shall we do to address prostitution? They would say, legalize it, decriminalize it, make it safer for the girls, because of course they're always girls, aren't they? And I would then say to them, why? How would that work? And of course they wouldn't know. They had no idea. They'd just read something somewhere. They think that blanket decriminalization of the sex trade means stopping arresting the women, which of course we all want, or we all should want. Many of us have campaigned against criminalization of anyone selling sex, every bit as passionately as we have to criminalize the demand. So they actually wouldn't have a clue. And when you gave them the information, if they were open to listening about how decriminalization further entrenches women in the sex trade, increases international pimping, which you might know as trafficking, and gives men carte blanche to abuse women and see us as vessels for their one-sided sexual pleasure, some of them would get it. But feminism is entrenched in mythology, even amongst some feminists. So, for example, is feminism about equality? Well, when you say to people, define feminism for me, tell me what feminism is to you, a lot will say it's about equality between men and women. Well, it isn't. It isn't. It really isn't. And we can disagree later, but we'll come to that in a little bit. First, I want to talk about a very persuasive myth that is both an old-fashioned myth perpetrated by sexist men and regressive conservatives, but it's also been taken up in woke terminology by the sex workers' rights lot, by the, what I'm going to call the cool girls, those trans women are women, sex work is work lot. You all know them. And they say that we, anti-male violence feminists, victimize women, that we put the fear of God into women, we exaggerate male violence, that there's nowhere near the kind of violence that we are suggesting, nowhere near the number of rapists, nowhere near the number of domestic violence perpetrators and the like. And that we are also infantilizing sex workers by saying that they are victimized. So the new wave of feminism promotes victimhood mantra comes from them. And interestingly, some of these women are white British women who have co-opted prison abolitionist the prison abolitionist narrative and theory and practice, led by a number of political African American people who recognize that prisons in the US are nothing short of a disgrace and a holding pen for the most marginalized people, given absolutely obscenely long sentences, most of whom shouldn't be in the first place. Of course, our prison system has some of that, but nowhere near as extreme. So prison abolitionists in the US argue that we should look at ways that we can manage violence and criminality in general within the community. Now, move that theory and that narrative to highly privileged white feminists in the UK, and it becomes an extremely dangerous argument. So, for example, we have a book by Alison Phipps, who is a UK-based academic. I had the book here somewhere, I now can't see it, who has just written a book telling white women off for being white feminists, where she clearly is hoping to absolve herself from any accusation of racism or ignorance. And she has taken this carceral feminist slur to new extremes. She has decided, and she's not the only one, that those of us that campaign to end male violence, that name male violence, are adding to the problem of the growing prison population, because we just want to put disenfranchised men in prison. If you take it to its logical conclusion, she's arguing that we are responsible for black men in prison who should not be there. It's an incredible leap of logic. And bearing in mind that in the UK right now, we have a 1.4% of rapes that are reported to police. In other words, the minority of rapes that happen. Out of those reported, only 1.4% are charged by our Crown Prosecution Service. So just think about that. We know that the majority of rapes aren't reported. Then they do get reported, and the Crown Prosecution Service think, well, we're only going to take the extreme few to court, because otherwise we won't be able to say we've got a 50% conviction rate. Because if we take all the rapes in marriage, the rapes by boyfriends, the rapes by colleagues, the rapes by men in clubs who've drugged women, and incidentally, drug rapes are never convicted, then we won't have a good conviction rate. So we'll just send 1.4 of them, the most extreme stranger rapes with knives and guns that are committed alongside burglary and the like, and it'll look better for us. So where are all these men languishing in prison who've raped women? I don't understand. Where are all the men who are serial domestic violence perpetrators? And remember, these are the men responsible for the more than 2 women that are killed in the UK every single week as a result of domestic violence. they rarely end up in prison. That's why so many women die. So far from wallowing in victimhood, anti-male violence feminists seek to end it. Some of us were tired by the time Hollywood got hold of #MeToo. We were tired of the "me too, it happened to me," because what we wanted was him too. He's done it. He is the perpetrator, and we should be focusing on him. It was the early 1970s when the first book written by a feminist survivor of childhood sexual abuse was published by Louise Armstrong, Kiss Daddy Goodnight. We've been speaking out for decades. It's a wonder our voices aren't hoarse. What we're saying is we have to end male violence. We will name it and we will push for the state to intervene. As I say, we don't think that boys are born programmed to harm or be violent. We don't think girls are born to be victims. And for all of Alison Phipps and her colleagues' accusations of carceral feminism, we wish we didn't have to use the criminal justice system, but we don't go along with the police like silly women taking on a law and order, deeply conservative religious agenda, wanting to lock everyone up. What we say to the state is, you have a responsibility to protect us, and you have a responsibility to arrest those men causing harm, serious harm, death, rape, and the like. We work against the state. We seek to challenge the status quo, not maintain it. But the highly privileged, white, wealthy women that now accuse those of us of carceral feminism, and it is an accusation, by the way. How do we know? Because there's not one single self-identified carceral feminist on the planet. So those women will imply, sometimes state very clearly, that white, privileged, wealthy women in the global north don't deserve feminism, don't need it, and how dare they complain about male violence. But those women need feminism too. All women do. So it's utterly outrageous that we are seen as being narcissistic, that we're seen as being petty and pathetic when we name male violence. How much more of a deterrent do we need to not name and shame men? That's what feminism is for, to actually get women to the point of where we will stand up and say, you stop this. We will stop you from doing this. It's quite unbelievable that there are arguments being employed right now in the UK that all progressive feminist engagement with male violence should not include the criminal justice system, should reject the criminal justice system in its entirety. We're called mainstream feminists. And what is mainstream feminism? Well, it's anything that the cool girls don't like. That's what it is. And the main discourse around carceral feminism, certainly right now in the UK, is in order to discredit those of us that wish to criminalise the purchase of sex. Men, because it is men, who pay for one-sided sexual pleasure with the most vulnerable of women. They argue that there's no such thing as trafficking, that these women are migrating for sex work. They defend and sanitise every aspect of the sex trade. And in doing that, they defend and sanitise male violence per se. Feminist law reformers are against the state. We're challenging it, but we recognise that we need a state. Another allegation from these cool girls is that we, feminists that do the work I do, are steeped in family values politics because, quote unquote, we say that the streets are unsafe, that there are lots of marauding men around who are dangerous, and that we want them all locked up. Well, actually, we say the opposite. We challenge the family. We have named the family the nuclear heterosexual family, as dangerous for women. We have been very, very clear about that. And we're also very clear that it's working class communities that bear the brunt of crime as victims and as perpetrators. So, the rank hypocrisy of these UK-based anti-carceral feminists is no more clear than when they argue for trans women who are sex offenders, convicted sex offenders, to be in prison with women in the women's estate. Now, what these anti-carceral feminists say is that how could we possibly argue for a prison sentence, even for the most dangerous sexual offenders, repeat sexual offenders? And many of you will know here that men are repeat sexual offenders when they get away with it, and most of them do. So they say, how can we possibly argue to put them in prison when they are likely to be raped in prison? Because, of course, prisons are extremely violent. Male prisons, of course, we're talking about. Well, in order to protect men from rape, we don't put them in prison, even if they are serial, very dangerous, prolific rapists. What a ridiculous argument, when those of us that work within campaigning on the criminal justice system always highlight the horror that is the prison system. We fight against the cruelty and inhumanity within prisons, whoever is in, on behalf of whatever prisoner, because we do not believe in unjust and inhumane punishment. We believe in deterrence. But these anti-carceral cool girls, they don't seem to mind about women being raped in women's prisons by trans women. No, they argue that convicted transgender people, male-bodied trans women, should be put in prison with women. There have been rapes of female prisoners, and there have been rapes of female prison officers by trans women. Not a peep from the cool girls. So, I want to look at what they say is the alternative to prison. And I'm talking about the UK version now of the prison abolitionists. They say that restorative and transformative justice is the way forward. Okay, well, what do they mean by that? I mean, let's face it, perpetrator programs for domestic violence, sex offences, been around for a long time. Have they worked? Well, no, they haven't, strangely, because when men are told that they have an illness, when they are medicalised as paedophiles as opposed to child rapists, which is what they are, when they are told that they have issues that they have to deal with in therapy because they have beaten their wives half to death, strangely enough, they don't take any responsibility. And they get to learn the language. They get to learn to abuse and terrify women through coercive control that might not give her a black eye, but keeps her in place nonetheless. So what they say is, we need a community response. So instead of putting a prolific serial rapist in prison, the community should deal with him. Right, well, it's funny, isn't it? But in my country, community leaders are only ever black and brown men, right? It's only ever black and brown communities that have these so-called community leaders, and that's a title imposed by white liberals on those communities that white liberals think should police themselves. So in other words, they are cultural relativists, and I would argue deeply racist. So for example, within the South Asian community here in London, there are self-proclaimed male community leaders. All of them are conservative, deeply religious men who would not be on the side of women if the women went to those men and asked for a community resolution for a domestic violence perpetrator or rapist or a child sex offender. So in other words, these responses, these community responses, would be about as useful as Sharia courts or rabbinical courts. Pointless, and a deeply conservative, regressive, so-called solution to violence against women. So to move on from the carceral feminism slur, we can't have prison abolitionism until men stop raping and killing women, raping girls, prostituting women, and all the other violence that they commit. But we can still campaign for prison reform at the same time that we demand that the state steps in and gives justice to the many, many victims of male violence. Yes, we need to look at the root causes, which is what feminism is about. We don't just want to lock up violent men. There wouldn't be any room. Let's face it, what we have always done is campaign to end male entitlement, machismo and misogyny that leads to men feeling like they have the right and almost an obligation to control us through violence and abuse. So I've got about 10, 15 minutes maximum now to carry on, and then we can have a Q&A session. But I now want to return to the issue of equality. So what's wrong with equality? How could I possibly say that feminism isn't about equality? It's mad. Well, back in 2014, I wrote a book on the state of the lesbian and gay political landscape here. And I looked at the way that it had at one stage been a liberation movement. Lesbians and gay men back in the 1970s said that they wanted to be liberated from compulsory heterosexuality, which we recognised was something that was imposed on all girls, and to an extent men, although they had far more freedom within it. And gay men recognised, those that were in the liberation movement, saw that the anti-gay sentiment that some might call homophobia, but I hate the phobia terms, so that anti-gay bigotry came directly from sexism, because these men were seen as feminised and feminine and not real men. So we worked together. And then, of course, it ended up where the lesbian and gay movement had become such a long acronym, the LGBTQIA, that a friend of mine said is not so much as an acronym, it's now like a very secure Wi-Fi password. So obviously, when the fight for legal equality became overriding, even while lesbians were still losing their custody of their children to violent men, when lesbians were being punishment raped, when our youth, our gay and lesbian youth, were being kicked out of their homes and their schools through bigotry, they decided that wealthy bourgeois lesbians and gay men should prioritise marriage. And I argued against this. But I didn't argue against only gays and lesbians marrying. I argued against marriage per se, as an institution. Clearly, if you have one group of people who aren't allowed to marry, if, for example, Jews were not allowed to marry, they could only have civil partnerships, but everybody else could, we would know that was anti-Semitism. So, of course, I wasn't arguing against equal marriage. I was arguing against marriage. And what I'm saying now about equality is not enough. If we pretend that feminism is just about equality, then we will lose sight of liberation. And we will say that we just want to be the same as men. We'll say that we need the same rights as men, we need the same pay as men, but it doesn't actually solve the problem of sexism and misogyny. And even in those countries such as Iceland, which was a while ago voted as the most equal country in the world, the best place for women to live, there's still endemic sexual violence and sexism. Men use equality law. For example, in the UK, a man identified as a woman at a bar one night because the bar was serving women a pink beer to celebrate International Women's Day for £1 less than they were selling the regular beer. So the sexism is just beyond a joke here. And the man argued that he should be able to buy the beer for £1 less. And they said, no, you're not a woman. And he said, well, I identify as a woman. And they said, okay, then here's the beer for £1 less. But he still took the case to an equality tribunal under the Equal Opportunities Act, because of course it applies to both. And he won. And he said it was humiliating for him to have to identify as a woman. If only all men thought that. So male violence doesn't end or reduce even significantly where we have total equality. And just imagine a scenario of Parliament where you would have 50% female MPs and 50% male MPs. Who would shout the loudest? Who would be heard more? Who would be listened to more? Who would be taken more seriously? Who would be the one sexually harassed at the water cooler? Who would be the one raped on her way home, so therefore she couldn't get into work the next day? Equality is a very tame goal, and we must reach higher than that. We need liberation. At the moment, though, what we have are women arguing in this new cool feminism that feminism should all be about choice. And despite the fact that they claim otherwise, this is a neoliberal concept. It's the politics of the individual. It's about naming any choice a woman makes as a feminist one, simply because a woman is making it. Of course, everyone wants choice. Of course, women are now, we've been denied choice for so long, everything is being labelled as a choice, but only things that are horrible and bad for women. So, for example, people with power don't bleat on about empowerment, do they? They don't need to. And so choice and agency and empowerment are all used together interchangeably. And if we can now just say, well, we can choose sex work, we can choose the full face veil, we can choose to marry and take my husband's name. If we say that, in what way have we been liberated to be making that choice? And who are the women with the most choice? It's the women at the top. Because we still have a real problem with any choice available to women in working class and other marginalised communities. So class as empowering today under choice includes buying shoes, pole dancing as exercise. In fact, there was a great line in a film which was two men, I'll remember the name of the film later, Ryan Gosling character, where he was talking to his friend at the gym, and his friend said, what are we going to do about this battle of the sexes? And the Ryan Gosling character said, it's all right, we've already won. We won the day that women started pole dancing for exercise. Men began using the choice argument to justify and excuse their own behaviour. So this choice feminism suits men down to the ground, which returns to the topic of my book, Feminism for Women. Because if we're doing a feminism like choice feminism, so I choose to be on a slut march with slut in lipstick across my bare breasts, and men are clapping and congratulating us. If we say we love sex work, who is it benefiting? Why do men like this feminism? A clue is, if men aren't threatened by feminism, it's the wrong feminism. Because they have to lose some power. I know that we say, and it's true, that men will ultimately, in the end, benefit from feminism when we're liberated because they'll have better relationships, all the rest of it. But they're not going to benefit in the short term because they will lose some power. And that's why they resist feminism all the time. And that's why they use women, the choice feminists, as a smokescreen for their own appalling behaviour, such as prolific use of pornography, of prostituted women, or of pushing religious fundamentalism as harmless. And it's exactly the same when it comes to the trans women are women ideology. No one's arguing that all trans women are violent, rapist, abusive, misogynists. But I will argue that trans people who have been through surgery and hormones have all been failed by the medical profession. Many of them are the victim of patriarchy. And I'm not talking about blue fringe narcissists who do the whole they, them, unicorn, self-congratulatory, attention-seeking nonsense. But I mean people who actually live as the opposite sex. They have been failed by the medical profession. But this doesn't mean that we have to actually take on the ideology. or stop resisting it. We must resist this ideology because it is based on a topsy-turvy view of what sex and gender is. Sex is a biological material reality. Gender is a social construct. It's what we call sex stereotypes, and it's harmful. And those with extreme transgender ideology wish to multiply gender. We want to abolish it. And that's why I won't use the term gender critical. I'm a gender abolitionist. So in a world where gender is seen as the new sex, why wouldn't you have men in feminism? Of course, men can be feminists under the choice feminist liberal banner, because all bets are off. They say there's no material reality in our biological sex anymore. So of course men can be feminists. Well, men can't be feminists, but they can be feminist allies. And when we go to conferences and we hear the usual pity plea of, what can we do to get more men involved? Well, first of all, it's actually not something that's going to help us if they sit up on the podium, on the stage, or write the leaflets, or take over the movement. We don't need them to swoop down in their superhero outfits and tell women how to do it. What they should do is do the childcare. They should stop other men raping. They should speak out against the sex trade. They should focus on that. They can be feminist allies. But choice feminists, of course, because they've done away with the notion of biological sex, would have it that this movement should not be a movement that centres women and girls. But we are the only social justice movement on the planet that centres women and girls. If a woman is white, Gentile, has independent income, is not disabled, then she doesn't share her oppression with any man. She shares an oppression with women, and it's that basic oppression of the fear and reality of male violence. And what the woke choice fun feminists can't bear is for us to have a campaign that centres women and girls, where we're not actually involving and including and centering men. And that is the problem with the new wave of identity politics. Anything is seen as an oppression except for being a biological woman. And we are, as a movement, and feminism should always be, as a movement, anti-biological determinist. We should never be essentialist. I do not believe we are oppressed because of our biology. I believe we are oppressed in part by our biology and as a tool, but not because of. Otherwise, we're saying it's inevitable and there's nothing that we can do about it. And feminists are the most optimistic that you will ever meet, because we believe in change. We believe that boys can be raised as decent human beings. We do not believe that men's penises will drop off if they can't access sex from a woman who does not want to have sex. We do not believe that men cannot control their sexual or violent urges. Not at all. So the future of feminism is about a feminism for women, unashamedly, with also a close eye on intersecting oppressions and a concern which we have always had about the way that women are multiply oppressed in some cases. But the centre of feminism as a movement has to be women's liberation from the tyranny of misogyny and from male supremacy. Thank you.